And with that, I'll introduce Dr. Jane Goodall. It's my great pleasure to introduce you. Jane is a founder of the Jane Goodall Institute, as Charlie just mentioned. She traveled to what is now Tanzania at the age of 26 to discover what was then the little known world of chimpanzees, and for 60 years conducted groundbreaking work, especially showing the urgency of protecting chimpanzees from extinction and redefining in particular the conservation needs to include the needs of local people and the connection between poverty and the environment and ecosystems. Today, there are 23 Jane Goodall Institutes around the world supporting a wide variety of programs, including 2 sanctuaries with orphanages for chimpanzees and Roots and Shoots, which is their environmental and humanitarian program, empowering young people to get involved with hands-on projects to do with animals and the environment in over 65 countries. When I looked on the Wikipedia entry for Jane, I counted 42 awards and distinctions. I'm not going to list them all, but as Charlie mentioned, she is a UN messenger for peace, and I think that summarizes the distinctions most aptly. Thanks for joining us today, Jane.
Well, thank you for inviting me to join you.
Jane, I'd love to kick it off with something you said very recently, which is, quote, "If we do not do things differently, we are finished. We can't go on much longer like this." Can you tell us what you mean by this?
Well, what I mean by that is because, first of all, we are destroying ecosystems and biodiversity. We're in the middle of the 6th great extinction of animals and plants. And the way that we have been disrespecting the natural world has led to the climate crisis. And I think everybody understands about the climate crisis. It's, to do with the emissions from fossil fuels and methane gas from including the intensive farming of animals, the billions of animals that we farm around the world. And the problem is the swing of governments in so many countries to the far right. And it always seems to be economic development on a planet with finite natural resources, where already we're using up some of them faster than nature can replenish them. And so these economic developments are always, or almost always, in most countries, put ahead of protection of the environment. And as we go on destroying ecosystems and losing our biodiversity and creating more and more of the greenhouse gases and poisoning the land with the chemicals used in modern agriculture and poisoning the ocean, polluting it, then it's quite clear that the window of time that we now have to change things, to start healing the harm we've inflicted, slowing down climate change, the future for mankind looks grim.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to talk about that timeline and the ecosystem emergency that we face really is unprecedented. The UN Biodiversity Report last year showed that we have wiped out 82% of wild mammals on the land, over 70% of fish in rivers and lakes, over half of the live corals around the planet are now dead, all in the last 40 years. It strikes me that had that happened in 4 months, rather than a bit more like the coronavirus sort of speed, than the 40 years over which that has happened, we would be reacting as humanity very differently if we suddenly saw all that life disappear. How do we install the same sense of emergency that is warranted by this situation that we have seen in response to coronavirus? Why haven't we got that same level of emergency response going on, and how can we get there?
Well, I think it's, going back to what I said about some of our political leaders and leaders in business, they're thinking of the bottom line and they're thinking of growing their profits and their shareholders' profits. And their shareholders are thinking of the same thing. And if we come down to the young people, and I work with young people all over the world, they get it. And fortunately now, they're beginning to find a voice and people are beginning to listen to them. my real hope is that the young people will make this change. But do we have time? Nobody knows how wide the window of time that we have left is, and it is closing all the time. I think, the fact that during this pandemic, I think people in the big cities, some of them, they've probably had the luxury of breathing clean air for the very first time. The luxury of looking
Mm-hmm.
up into the night sky and seeing the stars bright instead of through a haze of smog, or even a smog so thick that they can't see the stars at all. I've been in cities like that. And those people will not want to go back to the old polluted ways. But in some countries, however many people speak, it's not going to change the political will to disregard them.
Mm-hmm.
So I pray there'll be a groundswell of people around the world that grows and grows and grows until business and politics have to listen to them. But will that happen? I don't know.
When we have an emergency, it's to do with biodiversity. One thing that seems to be important is having empathy. It's like if we don't have empathy for and connection with animals and nature, we will never get there. So I'm curious, how did you come to empathize so much with chimpanzees, with your dogs, with other parts of nature, and how can we encourage other people to get there?
Well, I was actually born loving animals. And, where did it come from? I don't know, out of the nowhere into here. And I was lucky in having a very supportive mother who supported this love of animals, even though she would come into my room and find I'd taken on one occasion a whole handful of earthworms along with their earth into my bed. And she said, Jane, it looked as though you were trying to find out how on earth do these things walk without legs. When I was growing up,
Uh-huh.
there was no TV. And so it was books and nature.
Our generation and many before it have never seen a crisis quite like the one we're currently facing with coronavirus, the economic collapse, and the ecosystem collapse that we're facing. In fact, the last generation perhaps saw that. And I know you were very young during World War II, but you were nevertheless there. And that's the closest connection we have to a generation that did go through a calamity of this scale. What advice do you have to this generation in dealing with a global catastrophe of that order? What attitudes should we bring in? How do we approach it?
Well, I remember quite well, actually, World War II. And I remember how we got through it. We got through, there was a lot of humor. And I think, a sense of humor is really, really important. And of course, we had a very powerful voice telling us that we would never give in, we would never be defeated. And that was Churchill, of course. But, we learned never to take anything for granted. The food was rationed. We were lucky to get one square of chocolate a week. And there were people that I knew, my uncle was one of them, who were dying. And I was still being brought up on tales of World War One, where another uncle was actually in the army flying reconnaissance planes. So, we got through those with a feeling of we will not be defeated. So we're definitely going to get through the pandemic. We've got through pandemics before. We got through the Black Death and we got through Spanish flu and things like that. But the real problem is the climate crisis. I mean, that's an existential threat to the continuation of our life on this planet. So hopefully this coronavirus has shown us what the world can be like, should be like, because for a while factories were closed down and there was a less fossil fuel being burned. And so what we have to do, only don't ask me how we do it, but we have to get together, find ways of living respecting the natural world, realizing it's not that the natural resources are not infinite, realizing we cannot live without it, we depend on it and we're part of it, and get together to find ways of living off the grid, which is possible, and creating a new green economy and learning that, yes, we need some money to live It goes wrong when we live for money. And we have to find a way of thinking about what we value in life. Is it just money and acquisition of stuff to make us feel good? Or is there another way of measuring wealth?
Yeah, so if I can summarize it, it sounds like what you're saying is a real, to get through this emergency, we need a real stalwart sense of an attitude that we will get through it, and then a little bit of playfulness as well. And that's a great attitude, I think. And in terms of doing the right thing, I was just saying, also whilst you're offline, and because many of the people in this audience are technologists, and I was saying how it's not a silver bullet, but and sociological limits often hold us back more than technology. But what role do you think technology has, and how should a technical focused person, young in their career, think about focusing their efforts in this time? What do you think is the role of technology in getting through this global crisis of our age?
I think technology has an enormous role to play. And, it's technology that's led us into the possibility of having clean, green, renewable energy, making use of the sun and the wind and the tides. It's technology that is creating ways in which we can live in greater harmony with the environment. And, I've been talking to some scientists in Silicon Valley, and there are various products being tested. Now, I'm not allowed to talk about them, but from what I hear, there's some extraordinary technology being created now. We're blessed. The thing that makes us more different than anything else from chimpanzees and other animals, whom we are much more like than people used to think, is this extraordinary intellect that we have. And when we bend that intellect into finding solutions, and what I think is so important is to link the clever brain with the human heart, because when head and heart work in harmony, then I believe, and only then, can we attain our true human potential. But technology has a huge role to play as long as each one of us remembers that in our own individual lives, each day we make an impact on the planet. And let's use our intellect to work out, each one of us, and with wise people teaching, how we can leave the lightest possible individual, ecological, environmental footprint in our own lives. Those two together.
Okay, and how do you connect head and heart? What's your suggestion for people there?
Well, I think, head and heart, how do you connect them? If you are in tune with the natural world, if you have empathy with the natural world, all of that's coming from the heart. So you want to keep that feeling of belongingness and respect, and link that with what your clever brain tells you can do. Your human heart, your love and compassion, and your empathy will tell you what you should do. And we can't go forward forever with what we can do. What we can do and what we should are very often very different things.
Yeah. And getting to the...
Yeah.
No, finish your point.
I was just going to say, we can annihilate a whole country with a new kind of nuclear weapons, but we shouldn't. That's what I mean, that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And if you're talking about personal action, what are the three things, say, that you think people should do personally that can reduce their ecological impact and help minimize the impact on biodiversity?
Well, I think it's difficult to pick three because everything is so completely interconnected. But if we think about the consequences of the choices we make each day, what do we buy? Where did it come from? Did it harm the environment in its production? Did it lead to cruelty to animals? Is it cheap because of child slave labor? We start making ethical choices in our day-to-day lives. If we start making ethical choices in our voting and our lobbying, if we stick to those politicians we elect because they say they're going to fight climate change, but so often when they introduce a measure which might make us tighten our belt a notch, they're abandoned. And so many of them just cave in and say, all right, I better go with the flow if I want to keep my job and my position. So the consumer has a huge role to play, because if there's a company that does things in a way that we think is unethical, then we should not buy their products. It's as simple as that, and that has already made change,
So what I'm hearing is vote with your feet in your career, vote with your feet in your consumption, and vote at all for good politicians. Perhaps a quick summary there. I've got a question online that was that's come in about biodiversity loss and interdependence with the food chain. A bit like you've done a lot of work with the independence
Will,
of
I
poverty.
hate to interrupt such an important question and session, but we've run out of time for this session on the leadership stage, so we're going to have to pause there and move to the breakout Q&A stage. I see there are a huge number of questions that have come through, so I have no doubt the breakout Q&A will be brilliant. And I know that we started a bit late. Jane, thank you so much. That was an absolutely wonderful conversation to witness. And Will, thank you so much for hosting. We're going to wrap this session up now. And don't forget, if you go to the CogX app and you look under what's happening, or you search by breakout, you can find the breakout Q&A for this session with Will Marshall and Jane Goodall. And it's only left for me now to say thank you very much to you, the audience, and to Will and to Jane. And we'll be back soon.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.